Hello everyone and welcome back to the podcast, my channel where today after a long time I've been thinking about Deltarune and I'm here to make another theory about it. My Okay, for the last few months I've been thinking about a lot of stuff and namely the darkness petrifying since chapter 2 and my quest to find an answer to why the darkness turned to stone. I came up with this theory. To recollect, in chapter 2, we are introduced to the concept of darkness getting petrified in worlds where they quote unquote don't belong. And the most impactful example of this was Lancer, who turned into stone in front of Susie's eyes, and this is followed by Rules, who interestingly enough has his head not turned to stone during the normal routes. In the weird routes, he does turn to stone. This is followed up in chapter 3, where Ramp, who gets fully petrified if we don't do his quest, and in half of his face, I believe, remains unpetrified if we do the quest. The quest, as in the Shadow Mantle quest, in case you somehow missed it. Then lastly in chapter 4 a lot of enemies shift from being turned into stone and not being turned into stone. The first sanctuary enemies have the stone statues of the second sanctuary enemies and vice versa, and I believe the third sanctuary actually has all the enemies slash recruits not turned to stone. I'm not sure though. Anyway, no major character other than the original Starwalker is actually impacted by this, because Rules and Lancer are not in this dark worlds, and they are not impacted by this. Anyway, now let's go into the theory. My main goal with this theory is to explain the specific criteria under which darkness turns to stone. Other than the roaring, because according to Ralsei, when the roaring happens, all the darkness just turn to stone, regardless of what dark world they are in. Okay, starting in chapter 1, and we need, from the way Ralsei states it, it makes it sounds like the criteria is inherently linked to the dark fountain, which makes sense because since the fountains shape the dark world. Although this is presented as only applying to darkness from other darkness, but as we see later with the chapter 4, this isn't the case, but it does seem like it is more common for a darkness to turn to stone if they aren't native to that particular dark world. We also know from chapter 4 that dark worlds and what darkness can live in them without turning to stone depends on who makes the dark fountain, because the first sanctuary presumably is made by the knight, and it is very different from the second sanctuary, which of course we see on screen being created by Susie. This to me implies that the will of the person who made the dark fountain is the determining factor in how the dark world is shaped, which makes sense because determination and all of that. You probably know this from Undertale. This is obvious, again from other sources, but I felt the need to bring this up. So, who creates the dark fountain determines the dark world's nature and purpose. So, to connect this to darkness turned into stone, we have to connect this to the dark world whose purpose is the most clear, which is the chapter 3's TV world. Chapter 3's TV world made by Chris has the most clear purpose. Technically, so does the second sanctuary, but Susie doesn't do it for the purpose she says that she does. Her main motivation being to meet Gerson again, although she says it's to find clues. The knight's intention with making dark worlds, all things considered, is not doesn't present a clear motive, or at least clear enough for the sake of this particular analysis. So, what's the purpose of the TV world? Well, Tana, before his boss fight, explains that Chris made a deal with him to stall the Delta Warriors. And yes, Tana does seem to actually know that Chris is the one who made the deal. He, his dialogue implies that he sees the Knight and Chris as separate entities. So anyway, stalling the warriors is the purpose of the fountain, and as such, the TV world and all the darkness inside of it are given special abilities to ensure that specific goal specifically, namely the video game sections, which are meant to have the warriors explore and take their time, even incentivizing them to find secrets in return for the ranks, which by extension give them more facilities. Tenno also gets an ability to ensure this, namely being his ability to teleport the warriors to wherever he wants in order to keep them entertained and even trap them with those ball things. I don't know what to call them if they don't comply. The point I'm trying to make is that not only does the dark world give darkness a purpose, it also gives them the means by which they can fulfill those roles. So going off this, let's see the character that gets petrified in the TV world, Ram. It implies that he didn't fit in the world to begin with, by the way, as stated by the Pippins, the one Pippins who makes that no one will ever shed a tear for him line and all of that. But it seems like working for Tenna trying to keep Toriel asleep was enough for the fountain to decide that he is aligned with the purpose. So the fountain basically decides not to turn him into stone. He only turns to stone, if I recall, after he quits his job. We see this during Tenna's breakdown, but basically there's a scene where Tenna gets a call from Ram. Ram says that Toriel is waking up. Some dialogue happens, and Ram says he quits. But why does Ram turn to stone after he, quits, but still remains unpetrified if we do the sword route? For that matter, why does any darkner that we recruit not turn to stone the moment we recruit them? Aren't they defying the fountain's will and by extension the knight's will by siding with the Delta warriors? Because they are by their very nature of going against the siding with the Delta warriors, they're against the knight, and since the knight made the dark fountains, the dark fountains will aligns with the knight, and as such the dark fountain would basically disown them if they went against the knight's will. Well, the answer to this is actually given by Ralsei all the way back in chapter 1, where he states that a darkness purpose at its very core is to help lightners, and as such, since by siding with the warriors, two of whom are lightners, our recruits are helping us, or at least entering into an unspoken contract saying that they will help us if the need arrives. So think cases like fixing Tenna, fighting Queen, saving Jackenstein, etc. This also explains Ram's case, since he is technically helping Chris, or rather he is helping us, the soul, but physically speaking we are still a part of Chris, and since Chris made the dark fountain, it gives him enough purpose to not turn to stone, at least completely, because he is still aligning his own will with Chris's will, at least in a sense. Also, to those who are wondering, that Darkners we don't recruit simply continue with their normal purpose because they did not get recruited by us, so they don't turn to stone. Also, Rules doesn't turn to stone in chapter 3 because his purpose actually aligns with Chris's. he basically stalks the Delta warriors. Interestingly though, this implies that the Knight's will is not simply to stall or defeat the Delta warriors, since rules in the cyber world does turn to stone in chapter 2. And if the Knights will rush to simply defeat the Delta warriors, rules aligning himself with that will would have made it so that he wouldn't turn to stone, but him turning into stone implies that he isn't aligned with the Knight's will, which makes it so that the Knight's will isn't to turn, isn't to defeat the Delta warriors or stall them. Anyway, in chapter 2, Lancer turns to stone likely because one, he isn't from this world, and as we mentioned earlier, the efforts of getting it turned to stone are more common in those cases, as we discussed earlier. And even if he was from that world, he he also helps the Delta warriors, and funnily enough he turns to stone exactly after he helps Susie and Chris break out. My idea of why this doesn't affect the recruits from the cyber world is because, again, since they are from that world, the rules of the world are less harsh on them. In chapter 3, if I recall correctly, Lancer doesn't even turn to stone, at least to my memory, and the explanation, I guess, would be that Chris cares about him enough that he gets a free pass, basically. Chris was like, and also don't turn Lancer to stone, and the Dark World obeys them. So to summarize my theory, this is a short theory, all things considered. Darkness is turned to stone if they go against the will of their world's creator. Although if they directly align themselves with a Lightner, they are sometimes given a free pass. If a Darkner isn't originally from the specific Dark World, this rule applies more strictly to them. Even aligning themselves with a Lightner is not enough to keep them from turning into stone. And also, this theory might explain why specifically in many darkness in chapter 4 are turned to stone. In the first sanctuary, many of them have knowledge of the prophecy, so they likely tried to align themselves with the heroes. Obviously, the Knight's fountain did not like that, so they turned to stone. By the way, I say that they turned to stone despite having aligned themselves with the Lightners, because they actually didn't sort of align with the Lightners, like they tried to, but at the same time we learn that they don't even know who the heroes are for most of the chapters. So are they really aligning themselves with the Lightners and the Delta warriors? Not really. In the second sanctuary, Susie doesn't want to fight anyone, so it probably just the Dark Mountain probably decided that, oh, these are enemies here, so because the Dark Fountain's creator Susie doesn't want to fight them, they are turned to stone. But since the second sanctuary enemies, who at least on a fundamental level decided to align themselves with the heroes, and since this fountain is made by Susie, one of the heroes, their willpowers are aligned enough for them to not turn to stone. Again, this part is like very dubious, might I add. And my goal with this theory was to explain these things, but my hope is that at least with the points I'm making, even if this doesn't end up being correct, I get your brains running enough that at least one of you might come up with the right theory. Also, fun fact, the reason the second century enemies attack us, or for that matter any of the any of the recruits attack us in chapter 4. If I recall, the explanation for us that is that they thought we, as in the Delta warriors, were the knight somehow. Anyway, in the third sanctuary, as we see, there isn't much about the prophecy that mentions the heroes or the knight. So the Darkness, they aren't subject to enough information to align themselves with one way or the other. So they are just normal darkness in a normal dark world. So none of them turn to stone. So anyway, that was a confusing mess. Anyway, so that brings us to the end of another video slash theory slash discussion. So anyway, hopefully, even if this theory doesn't end up being completely foolproof and there are some holes to it, hopefully this got enough of you thinking that you might be able to make a better theory about it. So with that hope in mind, I hope to see you all soon. Thank you for watching and bye for now.